When you think of breathing, it might seem like a simple process: inhale, exhale. You don't even think about it. But behind each breath is a complex and dynamic system dedicated to delivering oxygen to every cell in the body and removing carbon dioxide. We'll start, as usual, by exploring the gross anatomy and the structure of the respiratory system, giving you an understanding of its key parts and how they work together. So, the respiratory system is divided into two main parts: the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The purpose of this tract is to allow for a pathway for atmospheric air to flow from the outside environment into our lungs, the organ of ventilation and gas exchange. So let's start by having a look at the upper respiratory tract. This includes the nose and the mouth, the pharynx, which is the portion that lies at the back of the throat behind the tongue, and the larynx, found slightly further down. The vast majority of humans breathe primarily through their noses, although some medical conditions can prevent this. The nose contains many tiny hairs and secretes mucus, which helps trap dust and pathogens. The nasal passages are also highly vascular, which helps warm and moisten the air. From there, air moves through to the pharynx or the throat, which is a shared passageway for both air and food. To differentiate between the two and ensure that food doesn't end up in the lower respiratory tract, the epiglottis functions as a mechanical flap, protecting the lower airways from aspiration. The next stop is the larynx, also known as your voice box. This contains the vocal folds that produce sound. The larynx is usually seen as the divider between the upper and lower respiratory tracts. The lower respiratory tract includes the trachea, which is a sturdy tube reinforced with rings made of hyaline cartilage, keeping it open and allowing air to flow smoothly. The trachea splits, the technical term is bifurcates, into two bronchi, which enter the root of the lung itself around the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae. These bronchi further split into bronchioles, which eventually, after a few more branches, lead to the functional unit of the lung, the alveolus. This overall structure is often called the bronchial tree, as it looks like a tree upside down. So, why is our lower airway structured like this? Well, simply put, in order to move oxygen into our bloodstream, the body must use a process called gas exchange. This involves molecules of gas shifting across a membrane from the alveoli into our blood, and this happens fairly readily on the microscopic scale. But it can't happen everywhere in the lung. In fact, the lower respiratory tract is split into two functional areas: the conducting zone, where gas is moved or conducted from one area to another, and the respiratory zone, where gas exchange actually occurs. The more functional units, the greater the gas exchange, and overall, the more efficient the process. Hence, lots of alveoli and lots of surface area for gas exchange. Now, the bronchi themselves also feature smooth muscle, which envelops the small airways and controls their diameter. Interestingly, the physiological role of airway smooth muscle in healthy patients is still unclear and a bit debated, although we do know that alongside the dilating and contracting to regulate our airway size, they also secrete some proteins that affect the immune cells, and immune cells are very active in our respiratory tract. In some diseases like asthma and COPD, genetic factors or damage to airway cells can cause inflammation and subsequent contraction of these muscles, leading to difficulty in breathing and that characteristic wheeze that you hear in asthmatics. The lungs themselves are the major organ in the respiratory system, and they are suspended in the pleural cavity, which is in the thoracic cavity. The pleura themselves are two very thin membranes which surround the lungs and, much like the pericardium, serve to provide lubrication and prevent friction. As the lungs expand and contract, a pleural fluid, which is secreted by the membrane itself, acts as a lubricant and allows the lungs to move freely within that chest cavity. The lungs are divided into several lobes, the right having 3 lobes, as it is slightly larger, not having to accommodate much of the heart, and the left lung has 2 lobes, an upper and a lower lobe. The alveoli themselves are tiny sacs of air. The average number across a set of lungs is about 480 million. We'll look at this tiny unit in more detail later on. Within the respiratory tract, there are a number of different cell types, but most of the tissue is made up of columnar epithelial cells, which are a type of protective cell type which stack together to form tight protective layers. These cells also usually feature cilia, which are small, hair-like structures which continuously beat in one direction, towards the throat, elevating mucus so it can be expelled or swallowed. This is called the mucociliary elevator, which I think is the coolest name ever, and it allows us to expel trapped irritants. In diseases like COPD, these cilia are destroyed, and that's why patients with COPD have such difficulty in expelling mucus. The tract also has a variety of glands and muscle cells, most notably the goblet cell, so named because it looks like a goblet, and its primary role is to create and secrete this mucus, which also helps capture inhaled irritants. So now we've got a bit of an understanding of the respiratory tract and the major organ of the respiratory system, the lungs. The other component of this system is the musculature and the nerves responsible for controlling it. While breathing is an unconscious process, unlike the cells in the heart who have that property of automaticity, meaning they can contract themselves, lung function is regulated by a few major muscles and it's under voluntary and involuntary nervous control by the brain. The main muscle in the respiratory system is the diaphragm, a large dome-like muscle which separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. The diaphragm controls inhalation at rest, and we'll explore the mechanics of this in another video. The intercostal muscles and the abdominal muscles also sometimes play a role. Any muscle tethered to the chest wall, like the sternocleidomastoid, can also assist in chest expansion, although they're not usually required. So the control of breathing comes from the respiratory centers, which can be found in the medulla oblongata and the pons, both regions of your brainstem. These areas have concentrations of neurons, the functional cell type of the nervous system, which take in information about the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood and stimulate the muscles of breathing to cause ventilation. This in itself is incredibly complex, and the body regulates its own environment to achieve homeostasis. So, this is our respiratory system. Probably more elements to it than you might have expected. Key to our roles are not just understanding the anatomy, but how these anatomical parts function. We can split the functioning of the lungs into a few key elements to understand. The mechanics of ventilation, as ventilation specifically refers to the process of getting air in and out of the lungs, not the gas exchange part. The gas exchange itself, moving oxygen and carbon dioxide from the alveoli to the blood and back. And finally, tissue perfusion, which depends on a few factors beyond the respiratory system. In the next session, we'll have a look at the mechanics of ventilation and how gas exchange occurs. Thanks for watching. As always, there's a quiz that comes with this video if you want to use it to check your knowledge. The QR code is displayed on the screen.